Hello, and welcome to our Wednesday webinar from the International Center for Sustainable Carbon. My name is Benedicta, and I'm part of the communications team here. Our monthly webinars are based on our technical reports, which are available from our website, sustainable-carbon.org. Residents of member countries and employees of sponsoring organizations can download our reports at no charge after a one-off registration on the website. Please type any questions you have in the questions box as we go along, and we'll try to answer them at the end of the webinar. The subject for today's webinar is Coal and its Potential in Developing Africa, presented by Paul Baruya. Over to you, Paul.
Thank you, Benedicta, and good afternoon, good evening, good morning from wherever you're tuning in from. I'm Paul Baruya. I'm a senior analyst at the International Center for Sustainable Carbon. I'll be discussing some of the main themes and topics in some of my latest research looking at energy in Africa. This webinar is based on a report which is actually currently pending approval from the editing team before it's sent out for peer review. So all data that you see here reflects findings from earlier in this year, with several updates for the purposes of this webinar. So anything presented here remains subject to revision prior to final publication. So bear with me. I'm just going to go on to the next slide. So as an introduction, firstly, I'll touch on some of the familiar challenges that Africa faces in terms of its economy in this presentation, some of the challenges faced by its people and its energy situation. We'll look briefly also at primary energy usage, final energy consumption in Africa, and show trends in power generation in the region. There'll be obviously a focus on coal power technologies, but also some solutions to help Africa operate its existing coal fleets in a way that's far more carbon efficient than perhaps it's been in the past. There'll also be some discussion on the prospects for carbon capture and storage, and also looking at carbon products. I'll go towards the end of the presentation. I'll touch on an overview on debt and finance, particularly China's role in African infrastructure projects, and then we'll conclude with takeaway messages. Now, the challenges in Africa are numerous and in some cases somewhat extreme from an energy point of view. Some of you may be familiar with Africa's social, economic and energy challenges. And while I won't be able to give you a complete comprehensive list of themes, I've just selected a few that might help us understand why coal power perhaps should not be completely dismissed by policymakers that are deciding Africa's energy future, nor should international institutions and banks perhaps subject African nations and corporations to sanctions on financing advanced coal power or any coal technologies or coal-related carbon and pollution reduction solutions such as CCS in some of the world's poorest regions. Now, Africa is a vast continent with major regions such as southern and northern Africa separated by the Sahara Desert, while east and western Africa generally straddles Sahara on either side. The northernmost city of Tunis in Tunisia is at the same latitude as Los Angeles, California, while the southernmost is Cape Town, which is at the same latitude as Sydney, Australia. So when one sees the continents correctly proportioned as they are on a globe, Africa's land area can swallow all of the countries that you see here on the left. It is actually said that the width of Africa is equivalent to the distance between Berlin and Beijing, so the land area is truly vast. The population of Africa is roughly 1.3 billion, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa, and Africa accounts for 17% of world population. This population will also be one of the fastest growing in the world, and for the rest of this century, Africa could account for almost half of all the growth in world population. In addition to that, the African population will tend to migrate and expand in urban regions, thus shaping the future needs for infrastructure, economic growth, and critically, the energy needs for Africa for the rest of this century. Today's half of Africa's energy needs are met by traditional biomass. You can see here on this yellow column on the chart on the right-hand side. used mainly in the residential sector, which accounts for as much energy as almost all the other economic sectors combined. And this is for end user energy usage. The total you see in the graph amounts to just over 600 million tons of oil equivalents, equivalent to just 6% of world energy use. Yet this energy supplies almost a fifth of the world population. So modern electricity services, therefore, have an enormous potential for growth and expansion. And how the region meets this will be defined by the numerous social, economic, and sustainability challenges that must yet be overcome during this process of energy transition. The different regions have an abundance of energy reserves. Sub-Saharan Africa is rich in coal, while North Africa is rich in oil and gas. And a few countries, such as Nigeria, have all forms of hydrocarbons. Several countries rely solely on hydropower, such as Ethiopia and the Democratic Republic of Congo, for their electricity supplies. And solar resources are is effectively abundant across the whole of the continent and is yet underexploited. Wind resources are somewhat more localized compared with solar, with some of the best sites being located offshore, much of it offshore of South Africa. Overall, access to modern energy such as electricity remains relatively poor when compared with regions such as Asia, and could worsen as the population continues to grow at some of these high rates that I mentioned earlier. The energy transition has a different meaning in Africa compared to how we define it in Europe. Say, in Africa, the transition primarily means shifting from smoky wood fuels used for cooking and heating in residential locations to cleaner smokeless cooking fuels, or using cleaner, more efficient wood burners. And of course, the other traditional mention of definition of energy transition is also moving towards lower carbon forms of power generation and transportation, so on and so forth. Much of the sub-Saharan Africa suffers from frequent or extended blackouts, and this report that will be coming out examines the negative impacts of regular intermittency and power supplies on the African economy as well. We also learn lessons from the technical and financial issues that have afflicted the construction of recent coal plants in South Africa and Botswana, as well as looking at matters regarding financially stressed mining operations that can also affect coal supplies in parts of Southern Africa. Now, this report doesn't just focus on overcoming problems associated with coal power and mining. It also highlights the other vulnerabilities and limitations of all energy resources. For instance, dependence on renewable hydropower, weak transmission and distribution, and also assessing the full system costs of variable renewable energy and its impacts on African energy systems, energy markets. Pardon me. Coal is relatively abundant across much of sub-Saharan Africa, as I've mentioned, with roughly 300 gigatons of reserves, although this is somewhat concentrated in South Africa, which has been mining coal for more than a century now. Production of coal in Africa amounts to roughly 260 million tons per year, and this is across the whole of Africa. And this is mainly steam coal, suggesting there could be some 1,000 years of coal left, but of course that's subject to the economic viability of these reserves, and global coal reserves and assessments has been covered by one of our authors, Graham Chapman, recently from the ICSC. South Africa accounts for most of Africa's production, producing about 240 million tons of the 260 million tons that the continent produces. This production has occurred mainly in the Witbank coalfields near Johannesburg, although the underexploited Waterberg reserves near the Botswana border are also considered to be promising in the long term. However, Africa has always had a problem of connecting new resources to markets, and these infrastructure impediments have always proved challenging. Pardon me. Coking coal production is somewhat limited in Africa, although Mozambique has been very eager to emerge as a major coking coal exporter, and there have been investments in recent years from international mining companies. But like South Africa, it faces challenges to get its coal production out to markets and to ports, so on and so forth. Coal and solar have huge potential to enable sub-Saharan Africa to remain or become self-sufficient in the region's ability to power its economies. From a coal point of view, as a global commodity, good quality coal can also be exported, as we've seen from South Africa and Mozambique. over the years. But more importantly, there are some major economic ramifications, such as being able to access the international markets means you can earn foreign currency, but also earn tax revenues, particularly for cash-starved state-owned corporations and governments, which are also prevalent in much of southern Africa. Now, moving on to electricity generation, this chart shows the growth in electricity since the 1970s, and my calculation based on IEA data has shown that growth since the 1990s has averaged 3.5% per year across Africa, and in 2019 reached 830 terawatt hours in total. Natural gas has emerged as the leading form of power generation in Africa, accounting for 330 terawatt hours, led by the gas-rich North African economies, notably Egypt and Algeria, which account for roughly 3/4 of Africa's gas-fired power output. Algeria alone has more gas reserves than the whole of Europe, so certainly there's certainly plenty of not so much a scope, but gas-fired power in North Africa certainly will be a leading form of generation. Coal-fired power has also emerged as the second largest source of power in the continent, reaching 260 terawatt hours, but this generally reflects activities in South Africa, which generated about 210 terawatt hours in 2019 from coal alone. Now, here are some graphics that represent the developments of coal power capacity over the years, derived from the Standard & Poor's World Electric Power Plant Database, the June 2021 edition. And on the left, this shows the trend by country, and on the right, the same trend by coal technology. If we just glance to the chart on the left first, South Africa dominates Africa's coal fleets, although half of its coal fleet, as you can see here, is aging somewhat, and within the next decades, half of its fleet will be approaching 40 years of age. So South Africa will be facing a crossroads in whether the country continues to operate these plants, continues to upgrade them, modernize them, or even replace them with non-coal alternatives. And we look at these issues in the case studies in the report. Elsewhere, really only Morocco, Zimbabwe and Botswana seem to have a noticeable amount of coal capacity. Other countries do have coal power stations, but they're very much smaller in scale. In total, by 2023, towards the end of that graph on the left, Africa will have more than 50 gigawatts of coal-fired capacity operating in 14 countries. There are 30 gigawatts of planned capacity in 16 countries, but I haven't shown that here because those are still somewhat sensitive. Africa's fleet is equivalent, however, to just 3% of all the coal-fired capacity operating in Asia today. It's also a fraction of the coal-fired power capacity that's operating in Europe and North America. So Africa's footprints on sort of world coal and CO2 emissions is actually tiny when looked on a global scale, and that sort of discussion is covered quite well in the report. Looking at the right-hand side, South Africa on the graph, South Africa and Morocco are Africa's leaders in terms of supercritical and ultra-supercritical developments, as you can see here emerging after 2010 and onwards, both proving that large thermal coal plants are able to operate at commercial scale in regions with limited access to fresh water. And we discussed that in the report, particularly focusing on South Africa in this respect. Morocco will probably not build any more coal plants under its current energy policy. It's a gas-rich country anyway, or its access, I should say, to a great deal of gas from its neighbours. And suggestions from South Africa suggest that Eskom the state utility of South Africa, will probably focus more on investments in renewable power and existing infrastructure improvements. Investments in the existing coal plants, however, should not be overlooked for Africa. Over time, degradation of components due to a lack of maintenance leads to poor efficiency and increased frequency in maintenance outages. And also can often lead to breakdowns as well. And that would apply to all power stations from using all types of fuel. But from a coal perspective, not investing in coal plants can also lead to higher emissions per kilowatt hour. So it's certainly undesirable for nations looking to decarbonise. There are, however, promising developments in India and China, where subcritical coal-fired stations can yield significant emission reductions per kilowatt hour with relatively little investment. In India, plant upgrades can achieve several percentage points in efficiency improvements, as well as a plethora of other improvements in reducing emissions. In China, there are subcritical plants that are being upgraded, which could achieve efficiencies equivalent to that of a supercritical power plant. So the rollout of these investments in regions tied to coal power should be seriously considered. And these solutions for efficiency upgrades and other plant efficiency work has been led by my colleagues, Dr. Beatrice Motika and Dr. Chen Zhu at the ICSC as well. For countries looking to scale down coal power or unwilling to commit to large-scale capital investments, the US has a US Coal First program, which has investigated a new role for coal, which could see smaller, more modular units. They'll be highly efficient, near zero emission units, but optimized to operate flexibly to load follow variable renewable power on a daily basis, or even act as a buffer to energy markets during periods of adverse energy disruption, as we've seen recently in Europe. So there are definitely some promising developments in the technology side. Now, moving on to decarbonising the coal sector in Africa, particularly coal power, there's a consensus that the global efforts to achieve net zero emissions can't be achieved without carbon capture and storage, whether it be from industry or the power sector. And as the GCCSI reported yesterday, CCS is gathering pace in many countries, particularly North America, and worldwide. $1 trillion market opportunity exists if CCS can be scaled up to, say, 100 times of today's rates to help the world achieve its net zero emissions by 2050. Now, in terms of coal power, the 2030 to 2050 outlook for coal-fired power is seen here on the right for Africa. Published by the US Energy Information Administration, shows how the pace of renewable and natural gas power developments will determine the role of coal in Africa. Yet, no matter what the scenario we look at, coal will still remain a somewhat significant source in coming decades in all the scenarios. The CO2 storage potential has been identified across Africa, but I believe a great deal more work is still required. A lot of the CO2 potential is actually located offshore in South Africa. The most advanced CCS project, however, is in North Africa, which is the Insala CCS plant in Algeria, which was built back in 2004 and fills a depleted gas reservoir with about almost 4 million tons of CO2 per year from a gas processing plant. So CCS is well proven and has been for quite a number of years. The second most advanced CCS project is only at the planning stages in the Mpumalanga province in South Africa. It's the pilot carbon storage pilots plants due online in 2023 with the aid of the World Bank funding, and is intended to demonstrate a proof of concept for South Africa's long-term CCS roadmap. The World Bank's also active in Botswana, where its CCS Trust Fund is allocating $1.5 million to Botswana to support CCS capacity and knowledge building, and also to hopefully extend this towards the whole of Southern Africa in general. For the latest developments in CCS, I would encourage you to go to the Global CCS Institute, which has only just recently issued its 2021 Global Status Report, but also look at our ICSC back catalogue of CCS work. And we've recently done work on the costs of carbon capture as well. Looking at carbon products, so we're looking at really less at combustion and more at coal conversion. The ICSC has embarked on a work program focusing more on using coal as an ore product. And the report very briefly discusses some of these solutions which are pursued in Africa, including coal-bed methane, underground coal gasification, energy storage in mines, and carbon products, as well as developing other carbon products such as biochar and activated carbon, as well as developing land resources that were once used for mining and can be repurposed into natural landscapes and also create them as carbon sinks. These issues are discussed in much more detail by my expert colleagues, Dr. Ian Reid and Dr. Leslie Sloss at the ICSC, and I encourage you to also check out their work by accessing our website also. Now, the report investigates how Africa finances large capital investment projects. We've done finance reports in the past, so briefly touch upon the situation in Africa. I won't go into every detail on this chart. You can catch up on YouTube at your leisure and look through each point. But here are just some of the findings that we see in this pie chart. And that the notion that Africa is increasingly owing debt to China is partly true, but not entirely accurate, as China currently only accounts for roughly 10 to 15% of all the existing debt in Africa that exists. But where China is investing in Africa, many investments are geared towards enabling Africa to produce and export goods and promote better economic empowerment of the region. And it seems to be China's strategy to try and create a two-way trade flow relationship between Africa and China under its Belt and Road Initiative. The BRI also being a topic that my colleague Stephanie Metzger has covered in detail in her latest publication for the ICSC. Nonetheless, China is emerging as a stronger partner in Africa because it offers a high level of technical expertise in infrastructure development, particularly in hydropower, actually which accounts for most of the energy infrastructure funding from China. But they can do so at a cost that's well below that of European firms, anything between 30 to 40% below the cost of an equivalent project that will be built by a European company. Nonetheless, China is still, still willing to cooperate with other nations when it comes to investments. So I just wanted to add that in as well. So China financial institutions have also proven to be very flexible lenders. They've shown willingness to also renegotiate and ease terms of payments for struggling debtors. So while there is a notion that there is this fear that there is a great deal more dependency on China debt, there are examples where, in fact, Chinese lending institutions have helped African borrowers. So some of the takeaway messages. African energy in the future will be underscored by major macroeconomic and development trends. The region will account for half of all the growth in world population for the rest of this century. Energy poverty and access to basic supplies of access could remain out of reach for millions still in coming decades. And so there's a very strong element of sustainable development goals in the energy picture for Africa. And I do discuss that in the report in a little more detail. The future societies in Africa will reside less in rural areas as economic migration drives more people to live and work in urban areas. And so we look at those trends in the report. And for the reasons for this is that there are much better opportunities in terms of better paid jobs, better job opportunities, and much better opportunities for females to engage in more professional work, which will also reduce the birth rate in Africa. Yet with this declining trend in birth rate, we'll still see a massive increase in population, and it'll become a more youthful population in the future as well. Africa confronts several energy transitions, moving from traditional wood fuel towards cleaner alternatives, as well as the other transitions that we will see in terms of cleaner forms of power generation. However, we do examine the impact of energy transitions on the coal mining sector in South Africa, which the term, pardon me, just transition will have to negotiate in coming decades if the region is going to move away from coal-fired power. There are some immensely important implications on particularly smaller operations in the coal mines in the region. Demand for modern energy services as a result of the increased urbanisation will have to go beyond just the basic supplies. And so this increasing demand for modern energy services will certainly stress test both current and future supplies of electricity grids, whether they be on-grid or off-grid. Renewables will certainly play an increasing role. I think that is seen in almost every scenario that we see, but experts feel that they just simply won't be enough alone to supply Africa's future energy requirements, that there will be a role for coal. Advanced HELE coal plants, high efficiency, low emission coal plants, could offer a proven and reliable source of electricity to smooth variations resulting from an increased penetration of renewable power. And also reducing the stress on fragile transmission systems, which themselves are suffering from underinvestment and require a great deal more underpinnings to strengthen those for increased renewable power. The commissioning of recent coal projects has not been smooth for some countries, and have also garnered anti-coal sentiment amongst the media and people opposed to coal. But these should be lessons that one can learn from projects and from experience from coal and R&D from around the world, such as India, China, and the United States. So rather than looking at the negatives, we do look at solutions for coal in Africa. They can adopt solutions to operating thermal plants in water-stressed areas, which we look at, and the ICSC has also done a great deal of research in the past in this area, and examine the considerable potential to decarbonise its fossil fuel fleets using a whole plethora of solutions. Perhaps also, as a side note, Western governments should perhaps revisit and commit to sustainable development goal pledges and accelerate support and financial supports for things like carbon capture and storage developments and reducing the emission impacts of existing coal fleet and building and providing support to clean up existing power stations with commercially available technologies that we know exists worldwide today. However, there are some promising signs in this respect. The World Bank appears to be funding some CCS projects in Southern Africa, so it's definitely a step in the right direction. African countries, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, possess enough coal to power the needs of their countries. Thus, coal, as well as other alternatives such as hydro and solar and gas in the north, can empower African economies and their local businesses and enterprises to achieve a certain element of self-sufficiency in energy rather than relying on quite expensive energy imports. I do go into, for instance, the problem of oil imports in some countries, and the fact that South Africa particularly, has been an expert in coal to liquids in past years. So this element of self-sufficiency in energy can be done quite easily with proven technologies, and provided projects are given sufficient financial and risk support to carry out such capital-intensive projects. And with that said, I think I'll probably wrap up and open up quite a fair amount of time for question and answers. I'll try and answer the technical questions as best as I can. I'll just open up the questions list. And Benedicta, if there are any additional points you want to ask as the questions come in, you may want to pitch in and fill in the silence. So I can't see any questions at the moment. I don't know if that's my system or whether there are no questions.
I see one.
Yeah.
Or do you see them,
Okay,
Paul?
thank you.
Do you want me to read?
Come up. Yes, please. I don't know why it's not coming.
Okay. How will China's decision to stop investment in coal abroad affect coal expansion in Africa?
That's a really good question. The answer is I don't know what the terms and conditions of how they defined it. Perhaps existing projects may still go ahead. Perhaps pipeline projects, for instance, maybe manufacturers in China may have received MOUs or maybe partial commitments to build and supply. So perhaps those pipelines might still go ahead. The answer is yeah. I think there's no doubt that that could be significant, and that's taken as the headline messages we've heard. Yes, that will definitely be an issue. That doesn't, however, preclude investment in improving existing plants, I don't believe, and I'm speculating, that it shouldn't preclude China from investing in carbon capture and storage or hybrid solar coal plants, infrastructure, and so on and so forth. I might want to remind people that I believe something like 80% of the energy-related capital investment in terms of generation was hydro. So renewables is a huge part of China's funding. Coal is a relatively small part. I believe it's 12%. I think 12% is another, even more is they finance natural gas power. So overall, in terms of impacting Africa, probably not the biggest impact, but in terms of new coal projects, greenfield projects in Africa, yes, of course, I think that has major implications.
Okay, thank you for that. There's one more here. With Eskom's current policy, will there be any more significant investment in coal in South Africa in the coming years?
Significant, I think, probably not at the scale that Kazuli and Majupi have been at. Although with that said, that was mainly funded from foreign sources anyway. The World Bank, I believe, stepped in to finance half of that. China Development Bank stepped in to finance over $1 billion of that. So whether it's not likely those organizations will step in. And also the Asian Infrastructure Bank, the AIIB, is probably not going to step in for new coal plants. My understanding is Eskom will not build anything of any scale. The message I get, however, is, well, what will Eskom do with its existing stations? I do believe they have a closure program of, I believe it's at least 10 gigawatts, but that's going to be the natural decay of their older fleets. So yeah, it's going to. I think the coal-fired fleets will probably shrink based on their announcements, but whether investments will disappear, I think it's unlikely. I mentioned that as soon as you stop investing in your existing fleets of any sort, whether it's oil or gas or coal, you'll see a degradation in your coal-fired technology that will be quite undesirable for emissions. And Eskom will still have to seek funding to keep some of the newer stations going.
Yeah. Related to this, there is a question saying, how will China's decision to stop investment in coal abroad affect coal expansion in Africa?
Yeah, that was the first question. That's again, it's a bit, we don't know yet, actually. I think we do have people that will be looking into that in due course, but until we, I think, see the details of that pledge, it's very difficult to say. But I think, as I said earlier, based on that simple headline statement, in terms of new greenfield coal stations, beyond perhaps what's in the planning pipeline, it doesn't look promising in that respect.
And there's another one here. Would focus on renewables solve the power supply issue with a more sustainable approach?
Yes, in some areas, off-grid, where it's rather expensive to connect remote urban, rural regions. Pardon me, where there is no electricity access, definitely renewables can. I've got a solar map in the I've also got a link to the solar map in my forthcoming report, so which is publicly available. But the link is, and yeah, it shows an absolute, an incredible resource for solar. But the other argument is, does the future of renewables happen with zero thermal power capabilities? Let's assume that the rest of the world is clamoring for battery storage materials and the same technologies to back up solar and wind. Can Africa afford to compete and pay the sort of prices that Europe's willing to pay, or even Asia? So the answer is solar and wind. Can they replace a baseload thermal power station? I'm going to say no. I don't think 1 gigawatt of solar. I'm talking about not concentrated solar power. That has a built-in storage system. I believe that's got some sort of liquid lithium, liquid metal storage system. But if we're looking at, say, rooftop style solar PV, 1 gigawatt of solar will probably output 80% less electricity every year than a nuclear power station, equivalent size nuclear power station. Just using those figures, I'd say the answer is no. Sorry if that was took longer to explain, but I kind of had to qualify why I believe that, especially with the growth in urbanisation and the trajectory of aspirations for the African economies in coming years. Don't get me wrong, I don't necessarily think that it's suddenly going to become the #1 steel producer in the world. Africa is going to leapfrog other technologies. They're going to look into other industries, other countries. They're going to look into technology. They're going to look into maybe less energy intensive industries, perhaps. So we may not see the explosion we've seen in China, but it's definitely going to be growth and positive growth for energy demand.
Yeah. How about coking coal, for instance, from Mozambique?
Yeah, that's quite a long story. I wrote a report on that quite a while ago. I haven't looked at it. I haven't looked at it in the reports, but I haven't seen the very latest reports. But yeah, there's been somewhat of an exodus of some Western mining companies from Mozambique. Some of the logistics challenges have proven to be a bit of an issue. It also doesn't help that Mozambique developed its coking coal resources at a time when prices were in decline during global recessions. So things like that really stutter progress in export industries such as that in Mozambique. Very promising though, really high quality coking coal. India's on its doorstep, as is the rest of Asia. It has got some good ports, so it's all there. The market conditions have to be right. But I'm sorry if I can't get into more detail on Mozambique, but there'll be more in the report.
Yep, there's another one here. Would there be any role for trash to energy?
Sorry, what was that again?
Would there be any role for trash to energy?
Oh, right, okay, of course. I think there's a global role for that. There's a lot of opposition, however. I think there's a lot of resistance to that because of the emissions. But what I haven't looked at trash to energy myself, and it's something that the ICSC I think is definitely going to be an area we're going to look at, and we're going to embark on studies. So no, thanks for that question. That gives us some impetus to look into that more. I think the answer is yes. How much potential, I don't know. The ICSC, we've developed a lot of expertise in biomass, and trash and biomass are not interchangeable. The technology of combusting solid fuels in any form as cleanly as possible with near zero emissions, it is something we look at, and the answer to that is simply yes. Trash needs a collection infrastructure, and so that has to be investigated for Africa as well as Asia and other countries. But I hope that's a roundabout way of saying yes, but it's something we need to look at.
Good. There's another one here. Any impacts assessed on the impact of coal mining in Africa, which has sustained employment and livelihoods?
Yeah, the report does look into that. I've been looking at coal markets since the 1990s, and got some wonderful contacts in South Africa. Yeah, there is definitely a fear, and the report does look into that. While the multinationals have all been trying to get out of coal, and they've been exiting South African coal for a variety of reasons, but a lot of the transfer of power in terms of the coal mining has gone to the Black Economic Empowerment organizations, which has sort of transferred much greater control to these types of organizations. And yeah, some of these are still fledgling, some of these are still trying to find funding to expand. Some of them are probably wondering what happens to their long-term future if you like, external powers prevent South Africa from fulfilling its cleaner coal potential. And the answer is yes. That's very much very much a fear. How far can a just transition go to save the jobs and employment in South Africa, which mining is a massive part of their economy. My report on the strategic role of coal looks into that in a lot more detail than I do in this report. So I'd encourage you to read that report, which I believe is downloadable for free for anyone now. It's not old, but it's now old enough to be acquired. Yep.
Yeah, there's another one here. South Africa has excelled with its CTL industry. How competitive do you think it is in the CTC industry?
I'll be honest, I don't know. I haven't looked at the costs of that at all, I'm afraid. I'm going to have to, let's take a note of that. And if the questioner could please leave their details, I think it's much better we consult an expert on CTL that we have in-house.
Yep. Okay, that's the last one here. Will water scarcity limit the growth of coal-based power in Africa?
Water scarcity, I think, will limit the growth of any thermal power, whether it be nuclear, gas, or coal. But the South Africans, despite the bad press that Eskom has received, has embarked on an air-cooled technology at a scale that I don't think can be seen in many places around the world. I believe there may be some air-cooled oil plants in the Middle East. So the answer to that is they can massively reduce water usage with the view that's sympathetic to local farming and agricultural requirements. So coal can sit alongside other activities in relatively water scarce regions. You still need good airflow, obviously. So the answer is water scarcity will be an impact, provided these can be alleviated with the right technology. It does cost more, but the technology exists to not require as much water to cool power stations, and costs have still yet to come down, but they will come down, no doubt, if it's deployed more widely.
Great. Thank you, Paul. I think that's all we have time for today. Thank you so much. And all that's left for me to say is the slides from this webinar will be available to download from our webinar page of the website shortly. And the next webinar from us will be on the 10th of November on the role of low emissions coal technology in a net zero Asian future, presented by Greg Kelsall. Thank you all for joining us today, and goodbye.